So, how do I use apologetics in the pulpit and on the pavement? That is Colin Mitchell, a friend of mine in Bournemouth, and that's where I'll be going to in a week's time, just over a week's time. And we do regular open air work there. I'm involved in open air work and I believe in it. If George Whitefield believed in it, and Charles Wesley and John Wesley believed in it, I know they had perfectionist views, well, we know all that, but nevertheless, God amazingly used these folk. And so actually, by the way, that just teaches that we need to have a humble humility in our presentation of the gospel. We may not have necessarily, even though we should have strong convictions, we need to hold them carefully and with a love for all the brethren. And you know, just while I'm on Whitefield, I read a wonderful article on Whitefield written by Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones in his book on the Puritans. And it really showed that Whitefield's desire was for unity. He didn't want that division, but he had to, because in his day it was a big problem. How do we reconnect the gospel to 21st century culture? This is a picture of King's Cross Station, and you know, it always amazed me, you know, the sort of, the basic structure is there, but they put all this other stuff around it to make it look sort of modern and give the impression that you don't really need to worry, even in architecture. Actually, you do. You've got to have the foundations right in all the buildings. It's not just a 21st century culture, it's a godless culture. Practical apologetics, then. We need to recognize the culture. I want to say a word about logic and rationality, which I believe is the weakest non-biblical, well, non-immediately biblical point. In other words, human reasoning and human logic would show that there is something really wrong with atheism when you consider the issue of where does your mind come from. And that's one of the points in this booklet, by the way. It's just to get people thinking. And I've never heard an atheist yet show me how original thought and rationality could have come out of the mud. You know, there's got to have been a mind there to begin with. Then the identity question, which I've already touched on, who am I? And then the issue of death and suffering. This is the way in my view. We need to recognize the culture. I actually like looking at Escher's paintings and drawings because they are so, you know, fantastic, deliberately fantastic. So you've got the stairs going nowhere. You've got water flowing apparently uphill in this one. And there's all sorts of things. But, you know, really, it's a sort of, it's a bit of a game with Escher. But there is a seriousness underneath it. I like this cartoon from a card. I can't remember, one of our family, was it you, Juliet, sent it to me? I can't remember. But I don't know where the card is now, but I love the pictures. In comes somebody and says insightful. Somebody else says or thinks compelling. Another person thinks exemplary, you know, looking at this picture. In comes the cleaner. And the cleaner thinks, it's upside down. And it reminds me of the book that was written by Rookmarker, Modern Art and the Death of a Culture. In this society in which we live in, commenting on the culture, there is a search for meaning in a meaningless world. And it's a desperate cry. I don't particularly like the paintings of Picasso, but this particular one, I think, does express it very well. You know, the brokenness of the woman crying here. You know, we see it all around us, don't we, on the news. The death of children, the desperate situation. There's a horrible description in the floods in China recently where people were desperately trying to keep their children above the waters in this carriage as it filled up with water. Oh, dear. The suffering that people have gone through with COVID-19 in India, which has been devastated by Indonesia at the moment, is the COVID is going all the way through it. What is the meaning to it all is basically what people are crying for. And modern thinking today has shifted very markedly to an idea that what you think are values must be kept private. Don't bring it into the public area. Because after all, what you're thinking about morality is non-rational, isn't it? There isn't an absolute truth. That's just your view, isn't it? You know? Who are you to tell me what's right and wrong? And so in the public domain, rationality, but I'm going to see in a moment that the very rationality that they claim to have, you know, is actually questionable. And their thought that they have facts, even that actually they're undermining themselves by the way they have no basis for saying what's right and wrong. And they've lost all concept of the fact that there is absolute truth. A book which is quite old now, it's quite a few years old, but it's called Total Truth. It's well worth reading by Nancy Pearcey. I found it very, very interesting indeed. I felt that it really did make some very, very good points. Francis Crick, years ago, who was no Christian, but discovered with Watson in America, who I think is still alive, he's very old now. Crick died some while ago, but he discovered the DNA with Watson in 1953. He was the one who really understood that there was an information system in the DNA. That was an incredible find. And he said this, I realized early on, or he wrote this in his book, I realized early on that it is detailed scientific knowledge which makes certain religious beliefs untenable. A knowledge of the true age of the earth and of the fossil record makes it impossible for any balanced intellect to believe in the literal truth of every part of the Bible in the way that fundamentalists do. And if some of the Bible is manifestly wrong, why should any of the rest of it be accepted automatically? And as I said earlier, a lot of these people fully understood the implications of believing in the Bible. Theistic evolution doesn't fit. Trying to avoid confronting origins, which is what the theistic evolutionists are doing, is actually leading to a lack of credibility in your witness to a dying world. I maintain that far from actually helping, and I've argued this with, I remember having an argument with someone in Chesterfield after a creation meeting where a young man who was heavily influenced by theistic evolution was trying to argue that our position was actually making a problem in witness. I think it's the opposite, that actually you're sowing the seeds of real trouble if you don't humbly keep to what the scriptures say. So we need to recognize that was just a brief overview of where the culture is at. The culture is totally all over the place. It doesn't have a basis for truth. But one of the great weaknesses of the atheist position, as I've said, it's explained in here a bit more, is where does logic and rationality come from? Even the well-known Haldane in the time between the wars, he was well known in his day as an atheist, but also a brilliant chemist. He said this, amazingly, if my mental processes are determined solely by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true. And hence, I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms. In other words, how do I know anything if I'm just a product of random motion of atoms? How can I actually trust any thought process? So he's basically saying, where does thinking come from? And he's got no answer. C.S. Lewis, humanly speaking, I'm not going to say I accept all that Lewis thought and all that Lewis wrote at every single point, simply because I quote Lewis. Lewis is a bit of an enigma, in my view. I believe he was a believer, but I think his understanding of theology was sometimes he was a philosopher, and I'm not sure he always saw how important it was to stand on clear, systematic, biblical truth. But having said that, Lewis is very quotable. And forgive me if you don't always, some of you perhaps don't always agree with Lewis, and I don't always agree, but I think on this he's absolutely right. Nature, he says, is quite powerless to produce rational thought. Not that she never modifies our thinking, but that the moment she does so, it ceases for that very reason to be rational. I'll unpack this in a moment. For as we've seen, a train of thought loses all rational credentials as soon as it can be shown to be wholly the result of non-rational causes. So let me unpack this. Supposing I'm not feeling well, right? As happened when I had my second incident in April. I was basically on the floor and I passed out. And I think I made all sorts of noises. In fact, at one point I did. Juliet, anyway, I was coming out of unconsciousness. And I screamed, I think. Did I, Juliet? And, I said, I was frightened anyway. Was Juliet going to take from my noises some sort of rational communication? No, not really. You're ill, right? You're in pain. There is something wrong with you. More poignantly, when your relative is suffering from Alzheimer's and they are in a home and they say, I don't know you. Who are you? Do you take that as a rational communication? No. You say there's something wrong with this person. Their mind's gone, right? You say, I see a banana flying in the sky. There's something wrong with them. They're seeing things. In other words, as soon as you can actually track it to something going wrong, you know that thought process isn't a product of original thought. But if I start talking about something in a reasonable way, about the way, not that the moon is made of cheese, but I actually talk about the moon being up there and reflecting the light of the sun, I'm talking rationally. Because you can also observe it. I'm communicating, and sometimes about abstract things, like I hear music, and you can hear the music, and you're saying, oh, that's a wonderful music, or a beautiful sunset, or whatever it is you're talking about. Or you're talking about mathematics, 2 and 3 makes 5, right? And you're talking about an equation and differentiation and integration and all the lovely things in mathematics that you love playing with, right? Well, that's rational thought, right? Okay, it's using sophisticated coding and all the rest of it, but it's not due to the egg that I may had for breakfast that I'm speaking like that. It's actually coming from my mind, right? That's what Lewis is saying. Rationality is a huge argument for the fact that we are made in the image of God. So rationality, when Einstein understood that E equals mc squared, and he was right, that it was proved in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that take a little bit of mass, you get a massive amount of energy when it actually is transferred into energy. It's the mark of mind. It's the power of abstract thought. Humans are the only creatures who think abstractly. In case you doubt this, think about dogs or any other clever creatures, and there are clever creatures. Even crows can take a tool and dig around to try and get insects and food out of a tree or whatever. And just thinking of a dog for a moment, a dog can be trained, a dolphin can be trained, a crow presumably can be trained. All these creatures can be trained. Taking the dog, you might say to it, that, or you might suggest to it, the dog is communicating after a fashion with you. You say, stay. And it knows that it will get a reward every time it obeys what you say, and it understands. And it gets a punishment possibly if it doesn't. But he associates that word stay with a behavior and performs that behavior. But he doesn't know what you mean when you say in a totally different context, hey, let's stay a bit longer on the beach. It doesn't understand. So the communication is very basic. It's not dealing with abstract thought. We have the capacity to pass technology on, both through words and particularly writing, which passes things on to generations to come. That's unique to humans. So with materialism, rationality has no meaning. Materialism, and I mean here atheism essentially, people who deny that there is a God have a real problem in understanding where their own minds come from. And the philosophy of naturalism, which basically, or materialism, which says that, everything is just matter and energy. My mind just evolved from the mud 13.5 billion years ago. There was stardust, and the stars exploded, and this became this, and that, and the other, and then life began in the oceans 4.5 billion years ago, and here we are, right? Well, where does your mind come from? The naturalist, or the atheist thinker, the materialist, is like this poor chap sitting on the branch which he's sawing away. He's going to fall because he's the wrong side of the cut. He thinks that he can do without God, but actually God gave him that mind, and he's denying the very mind that God has given him. That's the point of this illustration. You know what's going to happen. He's going to fall. So the philosophy of materialism undermines the very basis of all materialism. That is a very crucial philosophical argument. I know it's philosophy, but I'm talking about how do you do practical apologetics. I'm going to say in a moment that I believe in both presuppositional and evidential thinking. I don't believe that you have to, I know Abraham Kuyper, however you pronounce it, would say you've just got to be a presuppositionalist. No, I don't think you do. Yes, there are presuppositions. I know that full well, because Romans 1 teaches that they know deep down what the truth is, that they are suppressing the truth in unrighteousness, Romans 1:18. I know that full well. I know that God is sovereign to convert all whom he's going to bring to himself. And I know that his word will not return to him void. I know that, right? But sometimes the Lord used artful techniques. He would ask a question. Give me water to drink. Who did he say that to? The Samaritan woman. He got her talking about water. Then he chose the moment to say, if you knew where that living water was to come, you would say, give me this living water. And she then falls into the trap. And the Lord reveals to her who he is. Beautifully. And he was artful with the Pharisees. They would ask a question. He says, well, I'm going to ask you a question. And there was this constant questioning. And I believe that is the way we should do our evangelism. Back to Lewis again. He says here, again from the book Miracles, which is well worth a read, the naturalists have been engaged in thinking about nature. They have not attended to the fact that they were thinking. The moment one attends to this, it is obvious that one's own thinking cannot be merely a natural event, and therefore something other than nature exists. That's a very powerful statement. It's again making the same point, but using a different language to do it. Thought. Where does thought come from? A friend of mine once had a discussion after an open air meeting. Sorry, I've gone to the wrong slide. Oh dear, sorry. I'll get there in the end. A friend of mine once had a discussion after an open air meeting in Oxford with Professor Richard Dawkins, who happened to be coming by the very open air that he was conducting. It had just finished. And my friend, John Hawley, saw Richard Dawkins with his bicycle coming by, and he engaged him. And he got into, because John is a very gracious gentleman, I could just see John, engaging with him. And John Hawley used to be working for the Open Air Mission. And he said, well, at one point, he says, well, what about your brain then? Where did your mind come from? And you said to him, my brain is just a lump of meat. Just a bit. That's exactly the words he used. In fact, I think he came back for more. He went off, and then he came back, and John, who was very gracious, engaged him a bit more, and he still gave him, I think he gave him some literature to read. This probably did far better than I would have done. You see, Richard Dawkins believes that his brain is just a lump of meat. Well, if that's the case, why should we believe anything that Richard Dawkins thinks and writes about? Am I following just a lump of meat? No. Absurd. Foolishness. So this is a very powerful argument when it's rightfully used. I'm not going to say it will convince somebody necessarily, although it was used, a very similar argument, with C.S. Lewis when he came back from the First World War. He was saying, I have nothing to do with God. He was an avowed atheist. But when he thought about this point, he realized that he didn't know where his own mind came from. And that's one of the arguments that brought him to think again. Dawkins also said the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no desire, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Well, of course, he's bound to say that, isn't he? But it's on a wrong, faulty foundation philosophically. He hates philosophy, but philosophy is a very important matter. After all, when the Apostle Paul was in Athens, he didn't immediately quote the Old Testament, did he? Because he wasn't dealing with people who knew the Old Testament. He was dealing with Gentiles. He was dealing with Greeks who had their philosophies out. So he took a poem, or took, not a poem, but although he did quote a poet at one point, but he took that which was inscribed near to him to an unknown God as a lifting off point. The God whom you don't know, I'm going to speak about. And he used statements like, in him we live and move and have our being. Now that's a very important statement. He was basically saying, look, the God whom you think is unknown, I'm declaring to you. But he didn't immediately quote Old Testament texts, which wouldn't mean anything to them. Thomas Nagel, still thinking of this point, says in his book, Mind and Cosmos, which I would recommend that you read, some of you, materialist naturalism leads to a reductionist ambitions because it seems unacceptable to deny the reality of all those familiar things that are not at first glance physical. In other words, he's saying, where does the non-material come from? He's recognizing that there is a problem. If no plausible reduction is available, and if denying reality to the mental continues to be unacceptable, that suggests that the original premise, materialist naturalism, is false and not just around the edges. Perhaps the natural order is not exclusively physical. Boy, that's a huge admission. And he got really lambasted for saying it. He says, you're giving way to the creationists. You're giving way to the biblicists. And actually, of course he was, because he was actually being reasonably honest. Not all atheists are dishonest. I have a talk that I do in the open air, which starts with freedom, no God, no authority, no foundation for truth. We're just molecules. Haven't got a soul. We're just genes, not the genes you wear, but the genes inside you. And those genes are bits of atoms all strung together and molecules. They don't have a little label saying, I belong to David Kay or I belong to Andy McIntosh. No, they're just molecules. And they don't have free will. And so there isn't any freedom. So there is a contradiction. It's incoherent. And that's basically what reductionism leads to. Even Richard Dawkins was interviewed by an Irish interviewer once, who actually pressed him and eventually got him to admit that this is a real problem with his philosophy. You cannot understand where your own mind comes from. What is meaning and truth? Well, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So I am saying that there are two main arguments. Yes, there is the presuppositional argument, which is creedal, which obviously says, look, I'm believing in the Bible, and I'm going to suggest to you that this book is right, that it assesses where you're at. You can quote Romans 1:18, not 1:20, just at the moment, because I'm thinking of the presuppositional. But if you notice, and this is where I think Kuyper isn't necessarily got the whole point here, it says in Romans 1:18, that they suppress the truth. Hold is really the word suppress in the original Greek in Romans 1:18. I haven't put it up there. But presuppositional and creedal position says that we're just simply going to take the texts and we're going to quote them to people and believe that the Holy Spirit will use them. I'm not saying that's wrong, but I think there is also a place for Romans 1:20 thinking, which is just 2 verses later, says that they are without excuse because the invisible things of God from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. So these things we need to bear in mind as we're speaking with people. There is a real central point that we want to lead people to, and it is to Christ being everything. But we're not going to necessarily bring them straight away to that point. I want to bring people to Christ as the way, the truth, and the life. I know that in Proverbs chapter 8, it says that even in the Old Testament, the Lord possessed me in the beginning of his way. This is speaking of Christ. I know full well that everything is sustained by him, Hebrews 1 verse 3. I know full well that all things were made by him, John 1 verse 3, and without him was not anything made that was made. But I'm looking for a way in order to lead people to see that they cannot have from a materialist perspective, an understanding as to where their own minds come from. And it gets worse for them. They don't even know who they are. They don't know what their purpose is here. Let me just give you a few more quotes on identity. I've given you some already, but let me give you a few more. Lewis Carroll, who's behind the Alice in Wonderland series, said, "Who in the world am I? That's the great puzzle." Lewis Carroll was a very confused person. I think it comes out in Alice in Wonderland, even though, you know, there are some remarkable statements in those children's books. But they're a bit horrific in places. He's crying out for a meaning. And that's why there's quite a lot of philosophy in the Alice in Wonderland books that he wrote. Who said this? If I'm a legend, then why am I so lonely? Do you know who it was? It was Judy Garland, very well-known actress in her day, who said this: "Nobody will ever know I existed, nothing to leave behind me, nothing to pass on, nobody to mourn me. That's the bitterest blow of all." This gentleman committed suicide. He brought a lot of laughter in his day, particularly with the blood donor sketch. Tony Hancock committed suicide out in Australia. I've already quoted to you Nicole Kidman, who said, "I don't know who I am, or what I am, or where I am, or where I'm headed." So many people don't have a clue who they are. And the issue of identity today is probably one of the biggest single issues, because transgenderism and all that confusion brought with it is really an expression of the same point. Who am I? I want to be a girl, so I'm going to change my sex. And the number of people, and it's rising, who actually know that they made the wrong decision later. It's an expression of search for meaning in a meaningless world. The Tate Modern is full of stupid things like two-legged chairs and taxis with holes in. And on one occasion, somebody got presumably loads of money for just putting a pile of bricks. No meaning. Total meaninglessness. I'm going to show you a horrific picture. I hope you won't be offended, but it just illustrates the point. It's not that bad. It's just that it makes the point. This is a painter whom I wouldn't recommend generally, but if you read the book Modern Art and the Death of a Culture, which I quoted earlier, it's not the original Francis Bacon. This is a modern, or was a modern Francis Bacon from Ireland. And he did this picture. And it really illustrates, does it not, the harsh inevitability of hard atheism. Who am I? And he put against this painting, man now realizes that he is an accident, that he is a completely futile being. That summarizes it. What is the meaning? What is truth? What is beauty? Why are things beautiful at all? I mean, beauty has lost its meaning as well for the atheist. In fact, the atheist has no answers. I tell you why, because it can't even pose the question meaningfully. Because the question of where is meaning has no meaning. Because if you're just a bunch of molecules, 13.5 billion years old, and you're just reconstituted stardust, which is what Lawrence Krauss, that famous astronomer atheist, got a laugh about once. The stars died that you could be here today, and he was gunning at Christ by saying that. Forget Christ, he said. Atheism has no way to even ask the question, who am I, let alone answer it. That is the problem. They can't even pose the question, because for them it's blind, pitiless indifference. So not only have they they cannot answer where their own mind comes from, they cannot even touch on the question of who am I? Now, I believe that this sometimes requires time. And I'm going to quote somebody who not everybody would accept, but I believe he was right in an awful lot of what he said. And that's Schaeffer. Schaeffer didn't have everything sorted. I'm not saying he is. Please don't think that if I make a quote, it means that I agree with everything they said. I'm not. Schaeffer wouldn't have probably subscribed, I don't think he did, to a young earth creation view, right? But there were some very remarkable things that he had astutely understood, just like Lewis had. And the point I want to make about Schaeffer is that he had grasped that I'm not going to win the dropouts of the 1970s and 80s just by an odd word. I need to spend time with them, which is leading me to a crucial issue. That if you're going to win people, you have to be focused, possibly for a bit of time with people. That's one of the weaknesses, by the way, of open air work. Even though I do open air work, you do actually have to acknowledge that maybe you're going to have to spend a bit more time with this person. And it may be that it's the chap next door. And God's put you to somebody next door, and you can begin to invite them and just to get them to perhaps read a little bit of literature, give them my leaflet or give them other leaflets, you know, just make use of the materials. But I maintain that in order to win people in this generation who are locked into this, well, I'm an atheist, I don't believe there's a God out there. You know, you've got to sort of unravel it and say, well, where are you at? And that's what Schaeffer did. He'd say, well, why do you think that? And then begin to get into a dialogue. And if they start insisting on very, you know, full-blooded, hard-nosed atheists, it would say, well, where did your mind come from? Which is what John Hawley did in a very gracious way with Richard Dawkins, such that he went off in a huff saying, my brain's just a lump of meat. Well, at least he got him to realize that he was in an impossible position. And maybe that will register with him for many years to come. Who knows what God will do with that conversation, even now. So Schaeffer said, very interestingly, if man is not made in the image of God, nothing then stands in the way of humanity. There is no good reason why man should be perceived as special. Human life is cheapened. This was way before lots of things had happened. Sorry, I've got this twice. There is no good reason why mankind should be perceived as special. Human life is cheapened. We can see this as many of the major causes being debated in our society today. Abortion, infanticide, euthanasia, increase of child abuse, violence of all kinds, pornography. This was way back in the 1970s, but he could see the way things were going. Now, we are, of course, way down the line beyond him. But what he did in the L'Abri Fellowship was to engage people. And I believe that we have to engage again with people. One of the biggest issues that an atheist can't answer is death and suffering. Now, you may just use one of these points, but I believe it's logic and rationality, identity and meaning, and it's suffering, which is just totally... An atheist hasn't even got a leg to stand on to explain what's going on. Even The Guardian, that wonderful neutral newspaper, published an article once which admitted that atheism doesn't have the answer to morality. And it says in this article by John Gray, the reason Nietzsche, who had famously said God is dead, and then somebody actually used that phrase and put it on a wall, God is dead, Nietzsche, and then underneath it wrote, because Nietzsche had just died, Nietzsche is dead, God. But this is what they say, this is what John Gray said. The reason Nietzsche has been excluded from the mainstream of contemporary atheist thinking is that he exposed the problem atheism has with morality. Because that's absolutely true. John Gray is making a very important point. Nietzsche was no friend to the gospel, but what Nietzsche, and of course not, but what Nietzsche was doing, and we need to understand what happened in these famous philosophers who had a huge impact in their day, is that he was exposing, in a very graphic way, saying, God is dead. We've killed him. If you actually go to the original quote, that's what he says. But he's actually not really saying, look, I believe really that God is dead. He's basically saying, you who think that atheism is true, and I'm not denying that you may be right, but look at the way it's going, it's leading to disaster. That's what he's basically saying in his writings. And Schrödinger, who's a famous scientist dealing with quantum mechanics and many other things which, he's famous for, Schrödinger's equation. And if you deal with science, you'll come up with this. But he says this, I'm very astonished that the scientific picture of the real world around me is very deficient. And it then goes on to say, it cannot tell us a word about red and blue, bitter and sweet, physical pain and physical delight. It knows nothing of beautiful and ugly, good or bad, God and eternity. Science sometimes pretends to answer questions in these domains, but the answers are very often so silly that we are often not inclined to take them seriously. I quote that in this booklet, and you'll see that this whole issue of morality cannot be answered because the atheist has no fundamental yardstick to measure what is right and wrong. I debated this gentleman, William Provian, before he died, but he famously said, no life after death, no foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning for life, no free will. Jacques Monod, who's very famous in the evolutionary world, died some years ago. He says, man must at last awake out of his millenary dream and discover his total solitude, his fundamental isolation. He must realize that, like a gypsy, he lives on the boundary of an alien world, a world that is deaf to his music and is indifferent to his hopes, as it is to his suffering and his crimes. In the talk that I do on Against Atheism in the open air, I also not only speak about no rational foundation for mind, but no rational foundation for right and wrong. This is the biggest problem that an atheist has. Of course, you don't want to be saying that all atheists are the same. They're not. But one of the biggest issues, which of course we have in the country and have done for the last few decades, is the terrible abortion statistic. Did you know that the US has aborted the population of the UK since 1973? That's when it came in the US. That is abortion basically almost on demand. And in 2019, in England, the number of abortions, in England and Wales, was approximately comparable to the deaths due to heart disease and cancer. We are no different to the Canaanites with child sacrifice to Moloch, and the Lord judged in the Israelite conquest. I think this is one of the areas where we need to be aware that we're meeting people now, sadly, who will justify this kind of thing. And we often, particularly when we're speaking with ladies, they may well have had an abortion. So this is a very touchy matter. But nevertheless, life, if we're made in the image of God, is precious in the womb. And I think we have to be prepared to stand on these issues. Did you know that Iceland has virtually eradicated Down syndrome just by getting rid of them? And it says in Proverbs 8, verse 36, they that hate me love death. Atheism goes hand in hand with killing the unborn and killing those at the other end of the spectrum. It's a very sad matter that the Christian gospel alone really gives the justification and the robust answer to these terrible national evils. How do you decide right and wrong? Very interestingly, Melanie Phillips she's no Christian, but she is a very thoughtful Jewess. And she makes a very interesting comment on our society. The reason for the existential collapse in the relativist West is that we've adopted the philosophy that reality is merely what we decide it to be. Everything is a matter of opinion and individual perception. Feelings, second paragraph, feelings trump facts every time. No one's lifestyle is to be considered wrong or inferior to anyone else's. No judgment is to be permitted. What is right for me is what is right. What I declare something to be is what it is. I feel, therefore I am. Deliberately playing with Descartes' I think, therefore I am. That is where our society is. So I think that's really probably harping back to where our society, where I talked about knowing where we are as a society. But I'm bringing you back to that because I now want to say, how do you drive a conversation to Christ? We need to recognize the culture, but how do we actually personally get involved? Maybe from the pulpit I've been dealing with, but I've also touched on open air work. But whether it be in the pulpit or whether it be in personal work or work outside, I think we have to drive it to meaning and truth. I think those are the most powerful aspects of the weakness and the Achilles heel of the secularist position. They don't know where their own minds come from, they don't know who they are, and they don't know what meaning and truth are, as I've been explaining. This is one way of driving it to Christ, is to say, did you know that there was an interesting conversation between possibly I'm putting it possibly because I'm speaking with an unconverted person, possibly the greatest man who ever lived, and a man who was trapped with a political problem. It's obviously Pilate and Christ. And Pilate says, what is truth? I've earlier thought that he was saying it in a dismissive way. I suspect he wasn't, because I think Pilate knew what was going on. After all, his wife had come in and said, I've had a dream. Don't have anything to do with this man. Remember, he washed his hands. He knew full well that Jesus was without fault. And this exchange is so significant. I think this picture, is probably about right. I think it was more thoughtful. I don't think it was, oh, what is truth? He was trapped. What is truth? And there's a real poignancy in that question, because he hadn't grasped that truth was not just absolute objective truth, which he was perhaps questioning, but that truth was personal. And I believe this is what we have to do. We have to actually drive people by their own admission to say, well, truth is what I feel, like Melanie Phillips was saying, everybody's saying. I believe that is actually where we should go. Because if you take the conversation in a good, meaningful way, right, where I've used the word meaning, but you see what I'm doing, that you're getting them to actually admit that there has to be some sort of right or wrong. And why did this suffering happen to me? Why did my child die of leukemia? And it may be that sort of conversation you're involved in. They are searching for truth. They know that there has to be something. And I think we need to bring them to these encounters. It may be John 4 and Christ and the Samaritan woman, and you take them through that. Or it may be Pilate, like here. But I think we have to drive them to what I said earlier. I am the truth. I am the way. I am the life. Let me just say as I close, I've tried to engage not only in the open air, but I actually once went into a meeting where I was invited by atheists to what they call skeptics in the pub. I went to Birmingham and I did this, where I said, I'm going to take a skeptical look at atheism. And I went through very similar arguments to what I've done in this booklet. Actually, I had quite a good hearing. And there they were, drinking from their jars of beer and enjoying themselves afterwards. But they took quite a few books afterwards. I don't think we should be afraid, as long as a meeting is properly set up, in going into their own territory if they were prepared to let you do it. You have to be careful, obviously. You don't want to be trapped, as some CUs try to do, be like them, drink beer with them. And I'm not justifying that sort of behavior. But it was an interesting discussion that we had. People were there listening, and they did listen. I've also, in the open air, had arguments, as you can see, that I'm having here, with various people asking questions. This was at Bournemouth, and we've had some interesting conversations. But the real work is done by personal conversations. And can I encourage you, as I close, to consider not only being in the pulpit, but being prepared to do personal work in the streets. That's where you learn to sharpen the sword of the word. It may be that you can't do full-blown open-air preaching. You can't do it in every city. But you can put a book table up. And I'll tell you what we've done in Rochdale, not me personally, but my friend Kevin Matthews. He puts a table out like this, and he's very burdened for reaching Muslims, so he puts a lot of literature to reach Muslims by articles and booklets by Hisham al-Mostain, who's converted Muslim. But he also will put other books out, tracts and things like what I've written and others. And people come along and you start talking to them. That is a very good way of making contact with people. I think we need to get out of our comfort zone. We need to get out sometimes into the open air. We may not be called as George Whitefield to preach to thousands. Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones thinks that after the Apostle Paul, he was probably the greatest evangelist ever. But who knows? That's not for me to say he was right or wrong. I wasn't around at that time, and none of us were. But we are called to the generation that we're in. And I believe that we need to get out and talk to people. And meet people and see where they're at. It will feed back into your pulpit preaching. I believe that when you get pavement work and pulpit work together, one feeds into the other. And you begin to relate much better to your own congregation. Do it. Here's my own dear wife speaking at Cambridge to some students. Whatever conversation you take, however it goes, drive it to Christ. I've suggested various ways in which you can do it, particularly when it's suffering. You could say, well, the one who suffered the most is the Lord Jesus Christ. You've suffered, your daughter's died, you've just maybe a terrible car accident. I meet all sorts of people in the open air. They say, how can there be a good God when this happened? Well, yeah, that's true. I will sometimes bring out that our own son, Juliet and I, had a son who died when he was 3 months, and that usually quietens people to realize, well, you've been through it as well. But then say, look, I'll tell you something even more important, that God was prepared to give his own son, not only to bleed and to die on a cross, but to have the weight of all my sin placed upon him. And quote maybe Isaiah 53, that the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. We need to get them to realize that they're like sheep with no shepherd. Their atheism, their secularism is really a religion, and they've been led astray. It's very poignant. One person who used to be with me in the open airs was a young man, about 15, 16, got married to a Christian girl. Now, 12 years, 13 years later, he's moved right out into atheism. He used to be on my team. 2 or 3 years, he came to Cambridge to help me. Last year or so, in fact, he was met by the team at Cambridge. I didn't make Cambridge this year because I had the heart trouble. But I've met him also in recent years, and I spent a long time with him in the coffee shop, trying to go through this type of argument with him. I don't think I made, humanly speaking, much headway. But what I'd say this, don't give up. Pray for these people. At least, generally, a person who admits he's an atheist will talk to you. At least they usually will. Sometimes the harder people to speak to are the ones who say, I'm all right, I go to church, this, that, and the other, I'm okay, I'm doing what all that, they don't want to know. Sometimes the atheist is more prepared to reason with you. There we go. So that's the end of what I want to say to you. Practical work. Meet people where they're at. And let's be those who try to reach practically with our apologetics, whether it be on the pulpit or on the pavement. May God bless you all.